A woman wakes up one morning, reaches for her cup of tea, and her hand doesn't respond the way it should. She knows what she wants to do. Her brain is sending the instruction. But something between the thought and the moment has changed. She isn't panicking yet. She thinks maybe she slept on her arm wrong. Maybe she's just tired. But by afternoon, she's sitting in a hospital room and the doctor is telling her she's had a stroke. She's 52, she's a mother. She runs her own business, and in that moment, one question takes over everything else. Will I ever be the same again? If you are supporting someone through recovery, or if you are on that journey yourself, this episode is for you. Hello, I'm Maneesha Rajpal, and you are listening to Inner Architecture. I am an inner architecture coach, a certified handwriting analyst, a grapho-analytical therapist, and a counseling psychologist. And today, we are beginning something new. This is the first episode of the Neuro-Rehabilitation Series, a dedicated series that explores how the brain heals, how recovery truly works, and what it takes to rebuild broken system. This series is not about cures, it's not about shortcuts. It's about understanding the brain's remarkable capacity to reorganize itself and how that understanding can change the entire experience of recovery. And I want to start with the most important question of all. Can the brain really change after injury? Because here's the truth. Without that belief, everything else feels like effort without direction. It's like rowing a boat with no destination in sight. There is a neurologist named Norman Deutsch who spent years sitting with exactly this question. He documented his findings in a book called The Brain That Changes Itself. And what makes his work extraordinary is that it is not built on theory alone. He studied people who had stroke or had suffered brain injuries. It's about those people who were told, in the most clinical language possible, that their improvement would be limited. And guess what? It was observed that their brains had adapted. It was not that the damage disappeared in these people. Rather, we need to understand that the brain is a living and responsive system. That means, when given the right conditions, it can create new pathways, new routes, and new ways of organizing itself. Well, this ability has a name. It is called neuroplasticity. And I want to make something very clear. This is not a motivational concept. It is not positive thinking dressed up in some scientific language. Rather, neuroplasticity is a biological property of the human brain. It is real, it is documented, and it changes everything about how we understand recovery. And here is something that will stay with you. One of the leading researchers in this field, neuroscientist Michael Merzenich, said that the brain is plastic. That means the brain is responsive, changeable, capable of growth, not just in childhood, not just in early years of life, but from birth all the way to death. That means the brain sitting inside someone who is 60, 70, or even 80 years old, that brain is still capable of forming new pathways, still capable of learning, and still capable of rebuilding. In short, it is never too late for the brain to change. Let me take you back in brief modern history of medicine, where it was believed that once the adult brain was injured, whatever was lost forever. The brain was understood as a printed circuit board. That means if one component got damaged, it resulted in loss of specific function. But research and lived human recovery showed us something far more remarkable. The brain is not a circuit board. It is more like a forest. When a storm knocks down a path through a forest doesn't stop. Over time, slowly and organically, new paths begin to form. Not in the same place, not in the same way, but the forest builds new paths. Because that's what living systems do. They adapt and reorganize. And that is precisely what the brain does after injury. Now think about this in terms of something even more familiar. Think of an old radio transistor. The batteries are still there, the radio still works, but the tuning knob is slightly off. You turn it one way, the sound crackles. You tune it the other, you miss the station. You know the station exists. You can almost hear it. You just can't land on it cleanly. This is what a stroke or a brain injury does. The brain isn't silent. The signal isn't gone. It's just out of tune. And neuroplasticity, in its truest sense, is simply the brain's way of finding that signal again. Slowly, steadily, one day at a time. And now I am going to share you with one of the most extraordinary stories from Deutsch's work. Because this is not a story about mild recovery or a gradual improvement. This is a story that should not have been possible, and yet it happened. Paul Baquerita was a neuroscientist. His father, Pedro, suffered a severe stroke, one that destroyed 97% of the nerves connecting his cerebral cortex to his spine. 97%. The doctors were clear. They told the family he would never walk again because the damage was simply too extensive. His sons refused to accept this new reality. They began working with their father themselves, patiently, persistently, day after day. Simple movements, deliberate engagement, asking the brain to show up again and again, even when the response was barely visible. And something began to shift. Pedro Baquerita not only walked again, he recovered his speech. He returned to teaching, he climbed mountains, and he lived fully for years after that stroke. And here is what makes this story truly remarkable. Listen to this. When doctors examined his brain after his death, they found the original lesion, the stroke damage, had never healed. The destroyed tissue was still destroyed. And yet his brain had silently, patiently built entirely new roots around the damage. It had reorganized itself so completely that a man who was told he would never walk again climbed mountains. That is not a miracle. That is neuroplasticity. If this episode opened something for you, then do save this episode to your playlist. Because the insights we are going to build across this series are ones you will want to come back to again and again. Before we proceed, I want to ask you something now. Have you or someone known to you ever felt like the body stopped listening? Like you knew exactly what you wanted to do, but the body responded as if it was receiving a different message, entirely different? If yes, what you experienced wasn't confusion. It wasn't weakness. It was a very specific neurological gap. And understanding that gap is the first step towards bridging it. Many people after a stroke describe it this way. I feel like my body doesn't listen to me anymore. They often experience that their hand moves, but not the way they intend. Their legs move, but it's not moving to the instruction their mind gave. The movement is there, but it feels like not their own. It's like wearing someone else's shoes. That mismatch between intention and response is not lack of effort. Rather, it is the brain and body temporarily losing their shared language. And here is what I find most important about this: that gap, that place where the brain and body have stopped speaking the same language, is not a dead end. It is a starting point, one that responds beautifully to deliberate, intelligent, and compassionate engagement. Do you know that modern neuro-rehabilitation shows us that recovery is most effective when the brain is engaged, as compared to focusing only on muscles? And how do we do that? Well, by making the brain engage in activity which requires to plan, sense, and to adjust. I will come back to this one. Before that, we need to address what most people miss. Our muscles don't relearn on their own. In normal scenario, the brain and the body speak the same language. That is why you feel your hand is listening to your brain. But now this automatic and effortless conversation between the brain and the body is broken. And that is what needs to be consciously rebuilt. And this is exactly where so many recoveries plateau. Let me explain this. After an injury, the focus of majority of rehabilitation programs is on training the physical body. By building strength, restoring range of motion, and to an onlooker, it looks like a progress. But within the person, the very same moments do not feel theirs. Although they are making consistent effort, yet they feel some disconnection between their body and the brain. That is not failure. That is a signal. A signal that the brain hasn't yet been fully brought back into the conversation. Because here is what most people aren't told. Strength is not the same as coordination, and movement is not the same as neurological recovery. You can build muscles, you can increase repetitions, you can follow every instruction in a rehabilitation plan. All this is compensation, not integration. True recovery isn't built in the muscles, it's rebuilt in the brain. And here is perhaps the most quietly astonishing thing that Deutsch's work points to. The brain doesn't just respond to physical movement, it responds to thought itself. Research shows that our thoughts have the power to switch genes on and off, literally altering the physical structure and anatomy of the brain. What we think, how we engage, the quality of our attention, all this is information. And the brain is continuously responding to this information and using it to reshape and rebuild new neural pathways. In simpler words, recovery is not physical but also mental. The mind is not a passenger in this process. It is the driver. So here is what I want to take away from this episode. The brain that survived the injury is still capable of change. We can make the brain rebuild its pathways through deliberate and fine motor engagement, through movement that is small, intentional, and conscious. And this is exactly what we witnessed in Pedro's case. Recovery is not a straight line. It is not always visible from outside, but it is happening and it can be guided. One important takeaway from today's episode is recovery cannot be a solitary journey. True recovery will include rebuilding the brain's pathways and requires a guide who understands exactly how the brain communicates through the nervous system, through the intention, and yes, through the very movement of the fingers because they are directly connected to the brain. In the next episode, we are going to explore why the body can keep working harder while the brain remains a mere passenger, and what it actually looks like when recovery is being led by the brain versus when the brain has been left out of the room entirely. And if this episode stirred something in you today, then do consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear this. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for someone we care is simply hand them the right words at the right moment. This is Maneesha Rajpal, and you have been listening to Inner Architecture.